Hey guys, this is my second video sharing my experiences working in the tech industry with different types. The type I want to talk about today is the ESTJ. The ESTJ is fairly abundant in the tech industry. I believe there's data that shows that SJs are the most abundant type in IT and software. I've had the pleasure of working with several ESTJs in my career. Some of them were my managers, especially earlier on in my career. And as I've started my own business and hired people, I've also had the pleasure of hiring ESTJs. In general, I've had a pleasant experience working with ESTJs, but there are some challenges possibly related to the cognitive function differences between our two types. Now, I want to point out that this is purely anecdotal. It's only as true as my specific peculiarities and idiosyncrasies conform, as well as they conform to the INTJ archetype, right? Since there's a huge variance within the INTJ category, many other INTJs may not relate to these. The same applies to ESTJ or any other type. So here's a quick summary of the things I'll talk about. In the first three slides, I'll talk about thinking differences, and then I'll talk about how we prefer to, differences in how we prefer to organize when it comes to people, and then how we value productivity, how we define productivity, and how we measure it, and then differences in styles of management. And then finally, I'll talk about the points of harmony, points of discordance, and then on the 10th slide, I will share some tips to help INTJs and ESTJs work better together. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the thinking style. So this is a quick visualization of how I see the differences between how INTJs and ESTJs think. Since INTJs are predominantly intuitive types, our thinking tends to be somewhat more fluid. It seems to be a little more discontinuous, meaning that sort of fades in from consciousness to unconsciousness and then comes back again. We tend to rely on probabilities more than binary values. So in general, it's not as clear-cut as a predominantly thinking type like a ESTJ, ENTJ, INTP, ISTP, so on and so forth. So the first thing I've noticed working with ESTJs is they tend to have a very linear flowchart style of thinking. And this basically means that sort of like a syllogism in logic, the conclusions that they reach deductively follow from some accepted premises. And you can see this in their communication style when they literally create flowcharts for their employees. But also, they're very articulate, and they can explicitly lay out the different steps they took in their reasoning. Whereas with INTJs, even though we have the capacity to sort of compress our thinking into that form, it is a lossy compression. In my case, the way I visualize my thinking is more like a graph where there's complex dependencies where certain things are true sort of probabilistically, and the forks in my logic sometimes loop back. There are contingency plans, so on and so forth. So it's a little bit harder for me to lay out everything in my thinking explicitly. In addition to that, they tend to create boundaries for the subject that they're thinking about. So, for example, if they're dealing with a specific technical issue, they will limit their vocabulary and their entities that they care about to just that topic. Whereas with me, I tend to have looser boundaries, so everything in my mind is connected to something else. So if it's a database issue, I can think of a similar thing going on with pipes, or the way my mind works tends to connect seemingly disparate facts about the world and sort of uses them as analogies to abstract patterns. So it's not, I don't have clear boundaries. Everything is connected to everything else. Whereas with them, they seem to have the ability to sort of limit their concerns and the scope of their thinking to a specific issue. INTJs tend to I've noticed this with other INTJs as well. They tend to project out into the future and create sort of if-else decision tree sort of projections, which ESTJs are also able to do, except with ESTJs it tends to be binary. So at every point they want to sort of exhaust all the different potentials into sort of discrete outcomes, and then they would fork from there. Whereas with INTJs, it seems like the forks themselves are somewhat probabilistic. So it's a little bit more nebulous, and it could be, you know, for example, if for any given conditional, the number of possibilities could be 5 or 10 or infinite, really. And we're comfortable without collapsing that potential into a specific number. Whereas with them, they need to spell out all the different things that could happen, which can get exhausting. And finally, with INTJs, the logic tends to be a little less binary. What that means is truth tends to be more of a continuum. I've used the word truthiness. So, for example, if I'm dealing with, if I have to evaluate the reliability of a or the credibility of a piece of documentation, I would give it a value between 0 and 1. It's something like 0.5, 0.6, and it's ranked relative to other things. So I'm okay with partial information and partial values and delaying the decision of whether or not something's true until the very last moment. Whereas with ESTJs, they seem to sort of swap the variables early on in the process, and they have a binary attitude towards information where they either accept it as true or reject it as it comes in. A good quote to demonstrate the INTJ thinking style here is, let's account for all the contingencies and try to accommodate them. Whereas for the ESTJ, it's let's bound our thinking to these trusted facts and plot all the decision trees we can. The second thing that, second difference I'd like to talk about is focusing on abstract patterns versus concrete patterns. INTJs tend to generalize trends from eclectic sources, and some of this has to do with just the unconscious nature of introverted intuition. So if, you know, in my case, if I'm reading an article about economics or business trends, it's going to influence my decision making at work, and it kind of helps me forecast the general outlook of the world in the future. It's not specific to one thing. Given that the range of these sources is very wide, it's difficult for me to point to the specific source or a piece of data that inspired that line of thinking. So for this reason, it tends to be a little more abstract because it's not bounded to a specific source that I can point to, but it also tends to be a little more subjective. What I consciously experience are the patterns, so which would seem, you know, obvious to me and other highly intuitive people, but for ESTJs and other sensors, that's kind of difficult to see. And I take a more predictive approach to problems where I try to predict what could go wrong, what could go right, risks. I'm very comfortable with analyzing risk and doing risk management, sort of projecting out probabilistically, weighing the potential downsides with potential upsides. So it's an orientation towards the future based on abstractions collected from various sources. Whereas with ESTJs, they tend to conform their thinking to established ways of analyzing data. So if they've studied business, they would use business analytics, or if there's an author that they've read that they trust, they would use their specific method. So they have a more limited set of sources for their information, for their data. They tend to justify their decisions with data instead of abstract patterns, and for that, because of that, it's more defensible in a social setting. They also have a more reactive approach to problems. So in a sense, their vision of the future is a little blurry. So that's coupled with sort of being prepared for anything, as opposed to the INTJ's more selective approach. But it can also sort of lead to a naive expectation that the future is going to be like the past. Thirdly, INTJs, there's a difference in scope between INTJs and ESTJs. INTJs like to focus on the larger picture. They tend to be very future focused. So I have a picture of a telescope there, but essentially they're looking at how the business or the product fits within a larger ecosystem, which sits within another larger ecosystem. So there's a sort of concentric dependency that extends out into the universe with everything that I deal with. My orientation tends to be towards the future, so a practical implication of that is I am less concerned with what's already been done, what's been invested. The past is already fixed and rigid and unchangeable, so any sort of decision that we make should be based on potential future gains, not what's been sacrificed in the past or done in the past. I want to change direction, so I'm, if we use like a ship analogy, I want to change the heading if there's a better destination to go to. So I'm constantly keeping my eye on the direction of the larger ship, the company, the product, society, the world. I'm very comfortable with integrating unknown and novel things. So while I'm not as open to experimentation as the INTP, I'm considerate of the fact that not all unknown things are dangerous, and there could be benefit with integrating new things. I'm also fearful of stagnation, so given that my future perception focuses on trends, and the implication that within there is that the world is dynamic, right? Because trends are about change. Given that we're living in a constantly changing world, I fear that a company that doesn't adapt will stagnate. So I'm constantly thinking, is the ship moving in the right direction? Whereas with the ISTJ, the concern seems to be a lot more local. So they're concerned on the relevant picture. So for example, if they're a manager for a team, they're concerned about their specific set of concerns that have been sort of prescribed by their role. So if they're in project management, they just focus on that one piece. And then they also tend to be a lot more invested in what's been done in the past. So if there are gears in motion, if there's some sort of competency that's been built, they tend to sort of gravitate towards that because it's safe. There's a lot of sunk cost in it, and it's comfortable. So they're more likely to stay the course and more likely to resist change. Instead of focusing on unknown things, they tend to focus on the known things and try to improve them. So they like to improve processes, improve metrics, really improve people. They're also cautious of bad information. They have this fear that bad information can come in and destroy things, so they tend to create boundaries around that. So for example, if they're in one department and another department is not doing well, they can just limit their scope and not worry about what's happening in that other department. So a better quote for the ESTJ would be something like, is the ship functioning correctly? Are all the engines working fine? Are all the people on the ship fed? Do we have enough fuel? Whereas I'm concerned about, are we actually going where we're supposed to be going? And then there's organization. So this is how they like to organize themselves with other people. So with INTJs, it's a be your own boss mentality. I'm all about taking individual responsibility for my work, and I expect others to take individual responsibility too. I don't want to be responsible for someone else's work, and I don't expect others to be responsible for their work. So my preferred way of networking, which isn't really practical in the corporate world, but is a little more feasible in the startup world or smaller companies, is a more flat hierarchy approach where each individual is basically the CEO of their own job. I like loose boundaries. I think good ideas can come from anywhere, so I like to open up the flow of information between departments. I want to know about what everyone else is doing at the company. I want to understand how the company works. So for that reason, I like the exchange of information. And then as far as getting things done, I like to enforce contracts between individuals. So a person would commit to completing something or attaining some goal, and I would hold him to that standard. But I don't really think there should be a static role assigned to a person. So I'm very open to the idea of internal mobility and people learning new skills and moving to different teams. So whereas with the ESTJ, they tend to like a very traditional hierarchical arrangement. So a good example of that would be the military, or really most corporate settings, where orders kind of come down from top down, and there's a clear chain of command, and information goes up vertically, back up, and it's filtered at different stages. And this leads to siloing, in my opinion. But there are also benefits of that. So they tend to be very traditional. They tend to work well with traditional hierarchical environments. Responsibility for the ESTJ is more focused on the team. So if they're a manager, they seem to really care about being a leader for the team, being a coach for the team, being a mentor, and they tend to sort of feel responsible for how their team is doing. For that reason, they want to know everything that everyone is doing, because they hold themselves responsible for that. They also have stricter boundaries, so they would prefer to keep their team isolated from other teams, because it can sometimes work out in such a way that they're in a zero-sum game scenario where they're competing for resources or funding with other teams. So it can seem a little bit more tribal, a little bit more us versus them. They also like to create clear roles and responsibilities and attach individuals to that. So if a person is supposed to be doing something, that's what they should do. They shouldn't step out of that unless that role changes. For this reason, they tend to be a lot more tense and a lot harder on themselves and a lot harder on their subordinates, because they feel responsible. Whereas with the INTJ and myself in general, I expect everyone to work with autonomy, and this idea that a person should be responsible for the output of another person is troubling to me. So I haven't done well in corporate hierarchical settings where I have been made a manager for others. Okay, number five, productivity, effectiveness, and efficiency. So effectiveness is delivering value. That's how I like to think of it. So hitting goals that actually matter at a larger view of things. Whereas efficiency is more of local performance. So a good example would be using sort of a car analogy. An efficient engine creates or gives a lot of energy for a limited amount of fuel. Whereas an efficient car travels X number of miles for a given amount of fuel. So the purpose of the car is to travel. It's not to burn fuel. And that's kind of that's kind of how I see the difference between INTJs and ESTJs. Is INTJs tend to focus on effectiveness. So what's the purpose? Where are we headed? Whereas ESTJs tend to focus on efficiency, which is this part of is the car, are the different parts of the car functioning as best as they could. So that's the main difference. Another one is INTJs tend to be more system oriented, so they devalue human effort. So this idea that a person is working hard seems sad, at least for me, is the idea that a person has to spend a lot of effort to get things done. Is just an inconvenience, in my opinion. So the INTJ work ethic is just focused on getting as much done for as little effort as possible. So, which can be misinterpreted as laziness. Whereas with the ESTJs, they tend to sort of create conditions for humans to give as much effort as they can, and they seem to value the psychological effort reward mechanism a lot more than INTJs. So for that reason, INTJs tend to gravitate towards automating things, creating systems, minimizing redundancies, really minimizing the human part of work. Whereas ESTJs think there's sort of a moral aspect to work, so they tend to focus on evaluating human error and improving it on an individual level. So they would coach people and create systems for people, for individuals, and create paths, learning paths, growth paths. They also want to sort of hire and scale. So if in a situation where there's more work to be done, my preference would be to automate it, whereas they tend to sort of enjoy the process of onboarding people to the company and slowly watching them grow. Another difference between the between the INTJ and ESTJ is the management style. INTJs tend to prefer to delegate tasks, whereas ESTJs tend to micromanage sometimes. So how that manifests is the INTJ is more likely to just give you the requirements and the expected outcome, and it's up to you to do it the right way. They give you high-level strategic guidance about what to do, but they don't give you immediate feedback on whether or not you're doing it the right way. And when it's time to integrate with or submit your work, that's when they give you an assessment. So it's a longer feedback loop. Whereas with the ESTJs, they tend to sort of look over your shoulder and coach you along the way and give you guidelines on how to do small things, particular things, and they give you a shorter feedback loop. So they're more of they're more approachable as managers. Another difference is with the INTJ, INTJs in general are not that great dealing with people and emotions and human issues, so they tend to abstract the roles and responsibilities, and they, in an ideal company, nobody is irreplaceable except for maybe the CEO, but for that reason they plan for these redundancies. They plan for people being sick, people losing interest, people moving on. So it's a lot less personal for them to deal with HR issues. They're comfortable with swapping people or even letting people go if something's not working, or generally a little bit more comfortable than the ESTJ. And they believe that individuals are responsible for their own growth, and if they are not able to attain the required level of competence for whatever personal reason, they're okay with either substituting that person or letting them go. Whereas with the ESTJs, it seems like they care about people a little bit more, and they sort of have a parental attitude towards the people that they feel responsible for. So they're a little more likely to sort of investigate any individual or personal issues that may be affecting a person's performance. They're aware of let's just say human weaknesses like laziness and demotivation, and they'll create systems to sort of combat that, and they enjoy that process of helping people grow. They're more likely to prescribe opportunities, growth opportunities, resources, more likely to give unsolicited advice to help people according to their version of what needs to happen. Finally, points of harmony. So INTJs, things that INTJs and ESTJs agree on. ESTJs have a lot of practical wisdom, and I appreciate that about them. They are very worldly people. They like to read a lot about how the world works. They understand business, they understand economics, they have breadth. They also understand people, so they understand the difference between how things are done in the textbook versus how things actually work. So for that reason, I appreciate having them around. They have excellent attention to detail, so a lot of times I miss things in like numbers and digits, and they have a good eye for detail. They can make decisions really quickly, so things that take me a while to process, they make a lot of rapid decisions and sort of hope that some of them will stick. And they're better at directly organizing people. So given their extroversion and their sensing, they have more energy when it comes to dealing with people, hiring people, talking to people, coaching people, listening to people. So I appreciate those things about ESTJs. Some of the things that they've expressed about me and other INTJs is they like the ability to grasp complexity. They like that we can think of the whole organization in our head and sort of forecast what can happen, months and years down the line based on trends. They like that we have a visionary attitude, so we like to take charge and really invest the mental effort into looking ahead. They sometimes appreciate that we can think about really complex things very slowly, and that the solution we come up with is usually very well thought out and robust. And they like that we can. They use this quote where it's like, you're creating something out of nothing. So they like that we can create things out of thin air, because they don't see the causal chain. The points of discordance, things that we don't like about each other. So from my INTJ point of view, I find the ESTJ thinking style from a cognitive function point of view would be the extroverted thinking, extrovert intuition kind of loop. It's very broad but very lightweight. So kind of like how I described the flowchart, it's they decide that certain events will take place and then just trust that sort of gut level decision and go with it. So they don't handle contingencies as well as I'd like. They have a lot of speed, so they value speed, a lot of movement, but sometimes it can be circular. So with that, they just value a lot of motion, a lot of production without having a specific target. So very local oriented in that sense. Sometimes they can be rigid, and this usually is when I share too much information and they can't keep up, or they have too much going on, or it's not compatible with what they believe, or they're just tired. Is their reaction to that is rigidity. And finally, the lack of comfort with, or the their inability to sort of project outwards based on trends, because they rely on concrete facts, kind of makes them short-sighted. So they can make some investments or some decisions that provide short-term value, but I can just foresee that they're not going to work out ahead of time. What do they dislike about INTJs? I have a lot of impractical ideas, and sometimes my intuition works in such a way that I have to sift through impractical ideas to find the right one. And as I'm processing these, I sometimes share these ideas, and they tend to eliminate those that they think are impractical. Sometimes they entertain them, but in general, they know that I'm not going to work on all of these things, all of these ideas, so they find it somewhat wasteful that I'm thinking about them. INTJs and myself, we need a lot of alone time, a lot of downtime. Sometimes it's just taking a 2-hour walk to process things, and they find that inefficient in a local sense because it's taking time away from concrete task, so they think that's lazy. They also think that we're fantasy oriented because we can think of things that don't really exist. So think of problems that haven't been seen but are kind of lurking in the shadows. And finally, they think we're fearful because we have a negative bias. We project the worst possible outcome sometimes and try to avert it. So final slide. Here are some tips. So for the INTJs, provide examples, case studies, past data, give very linear cause and effect explanations, give clear requirements, be patient with redundancy. I know INTJs hate redundancy. And then sometimes you just have to conform to the power structure, hierarchy, because it helps with the larger harmony in the system, even though it doesn't make sense, even though you don't like authority. For ESTJs, give the INTJ plenty of time for reflection. Understand that some complexity is difficult to communicate. Some details, the INTJ is not going to have all the details because they process things top down, but they can intuit that the details are going to harmonize in the larger scheme of things. So you're just going to have to trust them and let the details get filled in as things progress. The INTJ sometimes wants to change things, and some of the hacks that they propose seem like violations of deeply trusted methodologies or truths for the ESTJ. And some of these hacks actually work, so sometimes it's good to be open-minded about these things. And then finally, to focus on the big picture and what matters. It's easy for ESTJs to get carried away with day-to-day stuff, local conflicts, local problems, small stuff like typos, and it's important to focus on the why, and that would help them understand where the INTJ is coming from.